Hello everyone, this is Dave Bretthauer. I'm going to be featuring the Wild Rose Stem Clear Stamp Set today. It's a stamp set that I designed with watercolor in mind. It has a lot of large areas for filling in. If you're like me and like to color, this is a great stamp set for you. It comes with 19 different sentiment stamps, so it works for a bunch of different kinds of projects. And it has a collection of different floral elements that we're going to be using today. It is a 6 by 8 inch stamp set, so it has very large elements to it and will take up most of the card. I love using images this size because you can really see how watercolors blend and change as they move across the surface. So let's get started. I've stamped out the Wild Rose stem on 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. And I'm going to go ahead and add some water to the petal areas that I'm going to be coloring in. You want to use a waterproof ink, of course, if you're going to be using watercolor. So make sure that's stamped and dry before you get ready to paint. Now I'm generously putting a layer of water over the portion of the petals that I'm going to be painting. If things dry out, then you can always add some more water, but I like to start with a wet surface before I begin any painting. You'll probably want to use a small brush. I'm using a number 2 round brush here to get into all the little nooks and crannies of this particular design. Just take your time. If you go outside the lines, that's okay, it's watercolor. But taking your time will ensure that you get the color in just the right spot. Now I'm going to add just a bit of color to the tips of each petal. I've loaded up my brush with some pink watercolor paint. And I'm just touching the ends of the petals and helping that move towards the center of the flower. This is a very light layer of color. I'm planning on adding more color later. Just keep in mind that it's easy to add more color as you go. It's a little bit harder to take some of that color away once it's on there. So just add a little bit and then you can go back and always add a little bit more. You can already see that there's portions of my petals that are wetter than others. You can see that watercolor paint moving across the petal quicker in some areas and slower in other areas. And that's okay, that's just the nature of how watercolor works, and that's something that you should embrace and work with because it's going to turn out great no matter what you do. Now I'm going to start a second layer of color. I wanted to warm things up a bit, so I've got a little bit of yellow paint on my brush and just painting right over that original area that I put pink down on. This is just going to warm things up, get it a little bit oranger. I'm going to sort of skip around a little bit, not necessarily get it in all the same places that I got before. And you'll notice that sometimes it's a little bit more intense. That top flower got a little bit more yellow than the bottom did. And that's something I do on purpose, just so that everything doesn't all look the same. I want to kind of make it a little bit random. So I want to punch up the color on certain petals, and other petals I want them to be a little bit softer. Keep in mind this is all still wet. I'm going to add a third round of color now too. So I've got a pretty strong concentration of pink on my brush, and I'm just tapping it into the tips of the petals there and letting the water do most of the work for me. It's just going to naturally migrate across the petal, and I'm just going to let that work on its own. Because from experience, I know that if I mess with it too much, I tend to kind of make some mistakes. So I want that work to be done for me with the water. Now my goal is to make these petals pretty intense. So I'm just going to keep adding a little bit more color to the ends of the petals, knowing that it's going to flow towards the center a little bit. And I can help it along a little bit, but I really want to keep most of the color towards the ends. Now here I've rinsed my brush. I have a little bit of plain water. I'm going back and fixing a few rough edges there and just pulling the color a little bit towards the center. And then I want to go back and punch up any areas that seem to be missing some color. There was a petal there that didn't quite have enough color on it for me. Next, while everything's still wet, go ahead and add a third color. We're going to be putting a little bit of purple at the tips of those petals. Just a little bit. That's just going to darken it slightly. Don't want to make a big dramatic shift here, but that'll deepen that pink area and give a little bit more gradation to those petals. Now you saw those areas on the flowers that I avoided. That's the underside of the petals. I'm going to go in there just with paint. There's no wet surface for me to paint on. It's a dry surface. And I'm just going to put some strong pink watercolor right on there. I want that to be more intense and a slightly different shade than what's going on the front of the flower, just to give a bit of contrast so you know that there's a front and there's a back going on. Now I took a look at it and decided it just wasn't quite dark enough for me, so I took some purple paint and added it on top of those areas that represent the backs of the petals. That'll give it a bit of more contrast, really make it stand out from the fronts, and give you a sense of perspective there and a little bit of depth. Now you want to make sure that the color doesn't shift too much, so it did seem a little bit purple, so I decided to add another layer of pink on top of that. Those layers all blend together to create a strong color that skews a little bit more towards the pink, but it's overall darker than the fronts of the petals. At this point, I'm pretty satisfied with the petals, so I decided to go ahead and do the centers of the flowers. You probably want to make sure that the centers are relatively dry, otherwise that yellow will start to blend out into the petal area, which could be nice, but if you want to keep that yellow sort of intact in the center, then make sure things are good and dry. You can let it dry for an hour or so, or give it a shot with your heat gun, but just make sure it's good and dry so that doesn't blend out if that's something you want to do. I've added a bunch of yellow on there. I'm not paying too much attention about staying inside the lines. And then I've gone ahead and started on the leaves. For the leaves, I decided to put a wet on wet technique down onto the leaves, where I'm going to be putting lots of different colors of green on top. So just so that things would show up on camera, I added a tint of green just so you can see where I'm putting those wet areas. And that naturally puts a nice base down for you to start working on the leaves. Now while things are still wet, you can go ahead and add in a little bit more green. I switched to a darker green here, and I want to see what happens when I add a little bit of paint to that wet area. You'll see it naturally try to move out and blend on its own. You want to resist messing with it too much, and then just add some more as you want. I've shifted to a different shade of green here, something that's a little bit bluer, and I'm staying towards the bottom of the leaf so that there's a gradation of color from the bottom of the leaf to the tip of the leaf. Now while that's working its magic, I'm going to work on the little dried areas on the rose hip side of the stem. Put a little brown on there, and then I couldn't resist putting a little bit of brown on the leaves. I don't want my leaves to be too perfect looking. This adds a little bit more interest. And since it's still wet, it'll continue to blend out. I'm just going to use what's left on my brush there to add color to other areas of the design, and that'll sort of mix and match across the green and brown areas. Now all that's left is to use the matching die to cut it out. Add a sentiment and you have a beautiful project. I hope you enjoyed the watercolor project that we did today, and I hope you'll try it yourself. Thanks so much for stopping by. And please check out all our products at memoryboxco.com.